Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. We haven't done a forecast discussion in quite a while, but we have a pretty potent setup for today across parts of the northern plains into the upper Midwest and Great Lakes region, so I thought it would be appropriate to do one for the setup today. SPC has outlined an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 across parts of northern Nebraska into much of central and eastern South Dakota, the southern half of Minnesota, into western Wisconsin with a slight risk, level 2 out of 5, surrounding that in the yellow shaded region there, all the way back into northeast Wyoming, western Nebraska, over into parts of even western Michigan. So a very broad area of severe threat for today. Perhaps significant severe weather on the table with this event. We do have a tornado threat that is in place for today. SPC has it right now at a 5% there from southeast South Dakota into southwest Minnesota there, including places like Sioux Falls up in to that kind of south central Minnesota area. Under the gun for the greatest tornado risk for today, 2% area surrounding that all the way into northwest Wisconsin. The greatest threats today, though, are going to be large hail and damaging winds, and those both could be significant. 30% hatched area for significant severe hail in the red shaded region there, so places like Aberdeen, again, Sioux Falls over into southwest Minnesota. Under the gun for the greatest large to very large hail threat for today, we could see some pretty large hailstones, 2 to even 3+ inches in diameter. Hailstones with any more robust supercells in that area. 15% region for large hail extends back into Wyoming and up into Wisconsin. So a broad area of hail risk centered in that 30% hatched region, the red stippled region you see there, from Aberdeen to Sioux Falls into southwest Minnesota. Damaging wind also going to be a significant threat for today. Could see some pretty robust wind gusts, 70, 80 plus miles an hour there, particularly again in that red stippled region there from southern South Dakota into Minnesota and western Wisconsin. So La Crosse, Minneapolis, St. Paul, over to Sioux Falls in that enhanced area for significant severe wind gusts. So all in all, a very widespread, perhaps significant severe weather event on tap for today. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's start off with our upper air maps here, 500 millibars to start. A couple of interesting features we see right away. Big old expansive ridge here across the eastern half of the country, as is typical this time of year. You can see the clockwise flow around the center of this high pressure circulation. So big old ridge here, but what is going to help flatten the ridge is this shortwave trough that is situated across the northwestern quadrant of the country. This is going to shift off to the east today and be our main impetus for severe weather across this northern plains to upper Midwest corridor. Now, there are a few little ripples here within the flow. You can kind of see one right in here across Nebraska into Wyoming at this point. Here, recording this just after 9 a.m. You can see it a little bit better down at 700 millibars. Let's go to our 700 millibar map here, and you can really see it pretty well here in the height contours at 700 millibars. Nice little ripple there within the flow, within this broader trough. This is going to be our main wave that is already starting to spark some very weak convection this morning out across parts of western South Dakota. You can see on the mosaic radar here some echoes here across western South Dakota. Those are some weak thunderstorms at this point, and that is being caused by a little bit of lift out ahead of this minor but fairly notable shortwave. This will continue to again move off as the entire trough moves off to the east. This will move off to the northeast as well and provide the impetus for severe weather development, severe storm development out across parts of central and eastern South Dakota, moving off to the east later into the afternoon and evening. So that is going to be our main synoptic scale player with forcing storms in today's setup. Now, we have not seen a very robust low-level response here yet. Our trough's still back in here. We do have some southwesterly flow traversing the Rockies here, so you would expect that we would have a little bit of a low-level jet to speak of. Not really the case. We have not had significant low-level cyclogenesis here, maybe a little bit of a weak cyclone right in there, but overall not much in the way of a strong low-level jet here, and that should persist throughout the day. Not expecting to see a lot of surface low or low-level cyclone development here. So our low-level wind profile is going to be a little bit nebulous, and that is going to perhaps temper the tornado threat just a bit. Low-level winds should remain somewhat weak, and so we are not going to have a ton of low-level shear to speak of. So we're really going to need any surface boundaries to help enhance the tornado threat today, and that is going to be in the form of a cold front. Let's go to our surface map here. current surface map. So we have a little bit of a broad surface low that has situated itself across kind of northern Iowa into southern Minnesota. Very broad, not really well organized at all, but we do have a cold front here. There is a surface low that is located well up into Canada. You can see the surface troughing right in here. So our surface low probably somewhere up in here off the screen, with a cold front going stretching down here into the northern plains and upper Midwest. Cold front not going to make much eastward progress today, so that's going to be our main boundary that we'll have to focus on for a more robust severe threat. Storms may even continue to develop out behind the cold front, and we'll zoom in here in a second, but storms may, to get the most accurate position of the cold front, but storms may actually fire and continue to fire to the west of the cold front, and then they'll eventually cross that cold front, moving into a better atmosphere, at which point the severe threat will ramp up. So kind of a unique initiation process here with this particular setup. We're not really expecting to see storms fire along the cold front, perhaps, maybe just behind it. Perhaps we could see some development along it, but we could see most storms develop behind the front, move eastward into the better air mass to the east of the front, and that's when the severe threat will really pick up. Back here to the west, not much lead cyclogenesis, as we talked about, ongoing at this point. We might see a little bit later on today, but it does not appear that we'll see that in any robust sense. So that is, again, going to keep the low-level wind profiles at bay. This surface low very, very weak. We may see a little bit of enhanced backing out here across parts of southeast South Dakota into Minnesota, northwest Iowa, for maybe a little bit of an enhancement in low-level shear and low-level flow. And backing of low-level flow, but not going to be much to foster a real significant and notable tornado risk with the storms today. Let's go down to the surface now. This is our current surface observation map. And so you can see where our cold front is situated. I'll draw it in blue here. We have northerly winds across the Dakotas and northern Minnesota, shifting to more kind of northeasterly winds here and more southerly, easterly or east-southeasterly winds across southeast Minnesota to more southerly out in here. So we have a very broad surface low, as we talked about on our broad surface map that we just looked at. But our cold front is going to be draped somewhere in here, somewhere in this kind of wind shift right in here, connecting to our weak surface low across the southeast South Dakota, northwest Iowa, southwest Minnesota corridor. And that cold front is going to kind of drape back off to the east a little bit. A little bit tough to tell, not a very significant wind shift in here, but we do have northerly winds over southern South Dakota, more easterly winds there over northern Nebraska. So we probably a cold front somewhere in there, and that's going to be our main boundary for today's setup. Surface low, again, going to kind of just meander around this area. You can see the counterclockwise flow around it. I'll draw some arrows in here once again so you can see that we do have a little bit of that counterclockwise flow right in there. So our surface low situated somewhere in here, not going to, again, move all that much. And that cold front, once the storms may fire back in here across parts of central South Dakota, a little bit worse air mass back in here, but they'll move into a very rich moisture air mass and very unstable air mass out in here across eastern South Dakota, southern Minnesota, and far northwest Iowa, and that's when things should really start to take off. So a very unique, somewhat nebulous surface pattern, but somewhat a surface pattern that certainly will support severe weather in this particular setup. Let's take a look at some soundings from across the region. We'll start here to the north at Aberdeen, South Dakota, which is up right in here. It's that station right in there. So northeast South Dakota. A little bit of elevated instability in play at this point. 72 over 67 at the surface. A little bit of a temperature inversion here, going up above 850 millibars. A little bit of a warm nose there. Still elevated instability at this point, 843 mixed layer CAPE, most unstable CAPE, about 1700 joules per kilogram. So plenty of instability at this point. We are expecting plenty of surface heating for today. We'll take a look at the satellite real quick. We do see some cloud cover out here back to the west associated with that plume of ascent ahead of that initial shortwave that we showed. And there are those weak thunderstorms ongoing across western South Dakota. Clear skies, though, remain across eastern South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota. Should remain the case today. Maybe some patchy clouds moving in, but still should be able to attain strong surface heating with the setup today going into the afternoon. So we should get those surface temperatures up well into the 90s, and that moisture should hang out probably in the upper 60s to 70s across this region. Very long, relatively straight photographs at this point, about 55 knots of effective bulk shear, so plenty of bulk shear for supercells. But this is not a wind profile you'd expect to see with a robust tornadic supercell threat. Very unique looking setup here. The winds kind of wonky there in the lowest levels of the atmosphere. But those are expected to work themselves out a little bit. Let's go down to Omaha, and you see a little bit better there, but some veering there with those winds in the lowest levels of the atmosphere. But we're seeing pretty much due westerly, fairly weak 850s, so not all that favorable for a robust tornado threat with this setup. And again, that's not expected to change all that much. We'll see mid-level flow strengthen a little bit as that little shortwave comes in and an enhanced belt of flow moves in with it. So later on, these winds will start to strengthen a little bit, going up above about 850 to 700 millibars. They will start to strengthening deep layer shear and making the environment favorable for supercells. But overall, just a wonky wind profile, not expected to change all that much, especially in the low levels. We actually have a negative storm relative helicity here, which could favor more of a left-moving supercell type mode with this setup. So that's why the tornado threat, I think, is going to be at bay today somewhat. We probably will see a few tornadoes here somewhere, especially going into the evening hours as the low-level jet ramps up on its kind of nocturnal cycle just a little bit, and we have some interaction with the baroclinic zone with the cold front. We could see that tornado threat ramp up, but overall, I don't think the tornado threat is going to be all that major for today's setup. Mostly going to be a large to very large hail setup with some damaging winds as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at some model data now. This is our 12Z NAM. We'll start at 500 millibars, so hot off the press this morning run of the North American model. So here is that ridge centered across the eastern half of the country and our trough here out across the northwest. Belt of enhanced flow over Utah, Wyoming, Colorado with that shortwave trough. Expected to again move off to the east today. We'll see that stronger flow start to impinge upon the region by late afternoon to early evening. Belt of 40 to 50 plus knots of flow there at 500 millibars moving in to help strengthen the deep layer shear and make this setup favorable for supercells. We can see the translation of that 700 millibar shortwave a little bit better here. So right away you see where that is, that kink in the height contours there across Wyoming into Colorado and even Kansas there. Just keep your eyes peeled on that. It moves off to the northeast pretty quickly today, flattening that ridge a little bit. And by 0Z, that enhanced flow is kind of right in there. So our shortwave somewhere in here, helping to kick off storms out ahead of it. And again, they'll fire back here across central and southern South Dakota and move to the east into a little bit better environment. And at this point, this is 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time, we should probably start to see an uptick in convective intensity and coverage as they cross into that better environment near and east of that frontal zone. So that is the progression of our mid and upper level waves here. Down at the surface, let's see how things progress for today. I'll zoom into our sector up here. Let's go to our Central Plains sector. A little bit of a weird sector here. Let's go to our Midwest sector. That's a little bit better. So right there you see our weak surface low in place there across kind of southeast South Dakota, northwest Iowa. Cold frontal zone drapes somewhere in here. You can't really tell on this particular NAM run, but let's see what happens with this surface low for today. And you can see it doesn't really move a whole lot, just kind of broadens out. Very nebulous surface pattern here, not really organized at all. And that's not something I like to see when I'm forecasting for a tornado threat, at least from a storm chasing perspective. This is not something that's going to be all that favorable for tornadic activity. You can see the wind shift here, so that again, that cold front not really going to move a whole lot, going to be situated somewhere in this vicinity here, and those storms are going to fire out in here, move kind of toward that boundary later on today. And that boundary, it's somewhat diffuse as well. So not your typical surface type setup here with a typical severe weather event. But we do have temperatures warming into probably, again, this is probably the NAM cool bias at play, but we should have temperatures into the 90s up in here across this region with dew points into the 70s. Let's take a look at our moisture. Plenty of moisture in place already. For today, if we go back to our surface data, you can see widespread 70s dew points out here across Minnesota, eastern South Dakota, eastern Nebraska, Iowa. So plenty of low-level moisture to deal with today. Even to the west of the cold front, where in our northerly flow, we still have dew points in the 60s and 70s back in here. So a broad, moist air mass out here for this severe threat today. Somewhat nebulous. Once again, let me zoom back out here and show you. Not all that tight. You know, we can kind of pick out our boundaries here, cold front somewhere in this vicinity here. But overall, it's somewhat of a nebulous, disorganized surface pattern. We go forward with time. that cold front kind of sags a little bit, and that moisture plume sags a little bit off to the east-southeast there. So let's zoom in here at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Let's zoom back in. So, our storm's going to be back in here, impinging upon better moisture going into the evening hours. Let's take a sounding out here. Southeast South Dakota, there near the Sioux Falls area. Let's take one in southern Minnesota as well. And this is what we're talking about. Plenty of instability at play today. 87 over 76. I suspect those temperatures are going to get higher than that, into the 90s. So, you think 93, 94 over 76. That's a very warm, moist air mass. Going to feel like a sauna out there today. And overall, plenty of instability. Over 4,400 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. Plenty of CAPE. So instability not going to be a concern today. But that does mean we're going to see robust updrafts. Storms that go up initially are going to rapidly become severe and take on supercell characteristics, given strong deep layer shear as well. Only about 29 knots here or so. 30 knots, that may be underdoing it just a little bit. As that stronger plume of flow moves into the region, we should see a little bit higher deep layer shear. So strong instability, adequate deep layer shear, that is a recipe for robust, intense supercells with a large hail and damaging wind threat. We move over to the kinematics here, our wind profile, and overall this is just not a hodograph that is going to be favorable for tornadic supercells. Very straight looking hodograph, especially in the low and mid levels there. Not any curvature really at all in the low levels of the hodograph. Very weak low level winds, very disorganized low level wind profiles. So not really expecting to see a lot of tornadic activity for today. Storm mergers, always the wild card here in these kinds of setups, and boundary interaction with the cold front could yield a few tornadoes in that region today. That's why the SPC has the 5% out. But overall, supercells that are not undergoing a lot of storm mergers or interacting with the boundary, not likely to produce a lot of tornadic activity given fairly limited low-level shear. And so mostly going to be, with this pretty strong instability and weak low-level shear, and adequate deep layer shear for supercells, that is a recipe for large to very large hail. Across southern Minnesota, not much different at all. Even stronger instability here, 5,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. Very moist air mass, 78 dew point there over southern Minnesota. That is going to be very gross to be out in today for sure. But again, that low-level wind profile, not at all favorable for tornadic activity. And so probably going to be mostly a large hail and damaging wind type setup. Let's go into the evening hours here today. Let's see if our low-level jet does ramp up a little bit as storms move off to the east. Let's see here. As they move into southern Minnesota, we'll see what the environment does. And the NAM just not showing a lot of improvement in that low-level shear profile. So I'm just not sold on the tornado threat for today. The photographs are certainly on the smaller side. Again, I think deep layer shear will be a little bit stronger, so we should be able to see some supercells out of here. But the NAM progging some pretty terrible kinematics for a robust tornadic supercell threat. But again, strong instability, large hail is going to be a pretty common risk with this setup. So storms should eventually congeal into more of a clustered linear mode here. That we should have some initial supercells back in here out ahead in the broad regime out ahead of the ascent with that shortwave, so they should form somewhat discrete supercells initially, but without a focus for storms there in the at the surface, probably not going to see a very long duration discrete supercell threat. And so we should see some clustering here pretty quickly, especially if deep layer shear does remain on the margins for supercells, more in the upper 20s. That is more kind of on the margins for supercells. More may see a mix of multicells and some transient supercells here. And that could mean a little bit more of a clustered mode, a little bit messy storm mode. So not expecting the tornado threat again to be robust today, and the storm mode may not cooperate as well with more of a clustered mode. We will see storms certainly congeal by the time they get into southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, western Wisconsin going into tonight. Let's take here at 6Z. This is going to be at 1 a.m. Storms will be moving out to the east, and just not a lot of support at all for a robust tornado threat. So mostly going to be large hail and damaging winds today. Again, storm mergers are the wild card in these types of setups, but not expecting to see a lot in the way of tornadic activity with this particular event, given these photographs. I do wonder if this is a NAM problem. Let's go ahead and take a look at the RAP model. Just for giggles here, let's take one out over southwest Minnesota here at 0Z, so 7 p.m. Just want to do a model comparison here to see if the NAM is a little bit out to lunch. We see a little bit better curvature there at first glance, but look at that wind profile. We're seeing northerly winds here at the surface. That is not at all favorable for tornadic activity. Let's see where our boundaries are located, and it just does not look all that great. Let's take one into western Wisconsin, maybe. It appears to me that, let's see. I want to see where our convection is in as the wrap has it, and it's all back in here. So here is where all of our convection is. This is at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So all of our convection is back in there. If we put on our surface map, you can see that is well behind the frontal boundary here. So in that northerly flow regime. So that is going to be the bugaboo with this setup for today, at least from a tornado perspective. Just not expecting to see all that much in the way of tornadic activity, given the limited kinematic profiles here and the displacement of where the storms are compared to the boundary and the overall warm sector. So a very weird, unique setup here for this part of the country. But again, large hail damaging winds, the main threats for today. Let's take a look at the HRRR for today and some other convection allowing models to see how they are handling this particular setup. So here we go. This is at the 12Z HRRR. It is progging those western South Dakota convective attempts there pretty nicely. Again, very weak convection, not expecting severe weather with this initial activity. Going to continue into the afternoon. We'll get some development out here across Montana, Wyoming, western South Dakota in that much drier air mass, dew points in the 50s out there. So those will be much higher based storms, damaging outflow winds, and some hail with those storms. But our main round is going to be out here, firing by probably mid to late afternoon. It depends if this ongoing convection continues out across western South Dakota. If this fizzles out, then we'll probably see redevelopment here sometime by mid to late afternoon out across eastern South Dakota. But this very well could continue. We could see additional attempts out here out across south central South Dakota, and that could end up becoming the main show, becoming reinvigorated later on. So we'll just have to monitor this ongoing convection a little bit, but nonetheless, we should see severe storms start to pop up a little bit more, coverage and intensity increase going into the late afternoon and early evening hours out here across the eastern half of South Dakota into southwest Minnesota. So that is what the HRRR model has here. Some severe storms out there across eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota. Fairly robust cores in there, so some large hail with those supercells and multicells. But again, you see a very quick transition to more of a clustered mode. That may be a product of the weaker deep layer shear. Let's take a look at 0 to 6 kilometer shear as is progged by the HRRR. And you can see these storms are going up in a fairly weakly sheared environment. Your deep layer shear is well back in here where your strongest 500 millibar flow is and your strongest mid and upper level flow is. You see 50 to 60 knots out here. So these storms out here back into Wyoming, western South Dakota, Montana, those could actually have a better chance of being supercells than your storms out in here. Very limited deep layer shear. Again, right on the margins. Your mid to upper 20s to very low 30s. That is definitely on the margins for supercells. We like to see really 30 to 35 knots of deep layer shear or greater for a purely supercell mode. And here we're just not really seeing that where storms are expected to fire southeast South Dakota into Minnesota. So that could mean more of a multi-cell mode with some transient supercells mixed in there, and that will have a tendency to cluster things out a little bit more and make the storm mode a little bit less favorable for really significant severe weather, especially tornadic activity. So here we go into Minnesota. You can see just a very messy, clustered mode there. Not a ton of very long helicity streaks there with this activity. So again, that is evidence of that more multi-cell, transient supercell mode rather than a purely supercell mode. Moves off into western Wisconsin, robust hail and wind threat with those storms as well. Let's go down to some other models here. Let's go to the WRF ARW. Just another convection-allowing model that we like to use. It has that western South Dakota convection persisting through early afternoon. Then additional development out here across eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota. Your stuff back here across Wyoming, very outflow dominant storms back in there. And you see just very quick transition to a clustered, messy mode. Again, very limited helicity streaks within this activity, so evidence of that more multi-cell nature to the storms. And I think that is going to be the limiting factor with this activity. But you can see pretty robust outflow starts to develop with this complex moving into eastern Minnesota, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, into western Wisconsin. So some strong winds there for sure, a possibility going into the evening hours tonight. NSSL WRF model. just another cam we like to use. So here we go. Has a lot of morning activity out here across Minnesota. That is not really expected to come to fruition. Not really sure what is going to be forcing that. We see some supercells back in here. This is a little bit of a weird run. It does kind of have this stuff from the Wyoming, western South Dakota region persisting into southern South Dakota and Minnesota into the evening hours and overnight hours tonight. A little bit of a weird run compared to the other two models. Let's look at the M-Pass here. So this is going to be the M-Pass run from last night, so the 0Z M-Pass. So here we go. Has that convection across western South Dakota, pretty nicely progged there. A lot of convection developing out here across southern South Dakota in this run, with your activity back here across the northern high plains. Some activity out here again also across central Minnesota. So a couple different areas here, but your main round is going to be this southern South Dakota stuff. Very robust storms there from far northern Nebraska into eastern South Dakota, southern Minnesota, going into the early evening hours, and that should again persist that large hail and damaging wind threat. Then the damaging wind threat kind of takes over as we go into Minnesota, northern Iowa. So the cam solutions are a little bit all over the place. Certainly not surprising given the sort of lack of organization in the overall setup here, especially the low-level setup. But the bottom line is that we are expecting to see robust severe weather today, particularly across that southern South Dakota into southern Minnesota, western Wisconsin corridor. So where the SPC has outlined the orange shaded region here, the enhanced risk, that's going to be your greatest bet for severe storms. And we'll probably see some tweaking of these outlook lines as we go into the afternoon hours today, as we get a little bit more information with where storms might prefer to fire out across this broader region of severe risk. But for now, the SPC has that level 3 out of 5 in the enhanced risk here in the orange shaded region. The yellow shaded region, level 2 out of 5 slight risk, goes all the way back into Wyoming to encompass that activity back there in that more well-mixed air mass. Again, more of an outflow dominant storm mode back in there, but a little bit stronger shear. So that could be, those storms could have a better chance of becoming supercells. If storms fire a little bit farther out in here, so southeast South Dakota into Minnesota, we don't see storms back in here across southern South Dakota, at least initially. We could have more of a multi-cell mode with some transient supercells in there. Again, deep layer shear is going to be strongest back out to the west, where your stronger mid-level flow is located. So if storms only fire out in here, far eastern South Dakota, southern Minnesota, they may struggle to become robust supercells. Still would foster a large hail and damaging wind risk, perhaps significant given the instability at play, but we might not see as long duration of a supercell threat. If storms can fire back in here, a little bit farther back to the west, where your mid-level flow is a little bit stronger and your deep layer shear is a little bit stronger, then we'll see a better chance for supercells. That's closer to the M-Pass solution that we just looked at. So then we'll have a better chance of storms becoming supercells, perhaps a more robust, large to very large hail and significant damaging wind threat with those. So a little bit of uncertainty still remains with this setup, but overall, if you are in the yellow, especially the yellow or the orange shaded regions here, definitely take all warnings today seriously, and if a storm is coming towards you, it definitely could have that large hail and damaging wind threat. SPC has that 5% and 2% tornado risk outlines there. I again don't think the tornado threat is going to be all that significant given a fairly chaotic, fairly nebulous low-level wind profile. Again, storm mergers always the wild card, and boundary interaction always the wild card. So we could see a tornado or two from through any favorable storm mergers or interacting with the cold front. But overall, very chaotic, nebulous, low-level wind profiles. Probably going to lead to much weaker low-level shear and more of a large hail and damaging wind risk. But SPC sees a 5% area fit there from southeast South Dakota into southwest Minnesota. But again, the main threat's going to be large hail and damaging winds, significant large hail possible, 2 to 3+ inch in diameter hailstones there within the red shaded region, red stippled region there, and damaging winds also going to be a threat, especially as storms move off to the east and congeal, and outflows conglomerate into a big complex there into especially eastern South Dakota, Minnesota, western Wisconsin this evening into tonight. So that's going to do it for this video. Stay safe out there today, and we'll see you next time.